And now I am pleased to welcome the next couch crew for the panel debate or discussion on AI agents. We have David Caswell, founder of Storyflow, and he has been quoted several times on stage already. I think a pioneer in exploring the intersection of AI and media. Then we have Florent Daudens. I forgot. I actually tried saying his name correctly. Daudens, press lead Hugging Face, where he helps put powerful AI tools in the hands of journalists. And once again, Irene J. Liu, Director AI Emerging Tech and Regulation at the International Fund for Public Interest Media. Wow, that was hard apparently, but really welcome all three of you. All right. So we're talking about AI agents now, and I think we'll start over here with David, just for some basic orientation in case we didn't quite get really into what is an agent. So when we talk about AI agents in the context of journalism, what do we mean? How are they different from the AI tools that we are used to using now?
Okay, so I'll start off by just talking very, very briefly about what is not an agent. So an LLM is not an agent on its own. An LLM, you ask it something, it responds. These little characters like character AI or the kind of virtual boyfriends and girlfriends, they might have agentic processes behind them, but they're not in and of themselves agents. What an agent is a combination of reasoning and action in the environment. So the reasoning, if you've played with these reasoning models, and especially if you followed the chain of thought in the reasoning models, you'll see that there's this sort of new kind of inference type time or kind of prompt time computation that's going on that's very much like the thought pattern of a person. And what an agent is kind of using that reasoning to deconstruct goals into tasks, and to do that sometimes multiple times to the point where you can actually act on the tasks. And then there's a toolkit. Some of it is using the computer, like moving the cursor on a page, or some of it is formulating structured information for an API call so you can talk to a database or something. And it's the combination of that reasoning, especially in deconstructing tasks, combined with the ability to act in the environment that makes an agent. And for news, the thing that it does for news is, I think many of us in the industry have been on this kind of journey where we start off prompting and we might make a custom GPT or something like that, and then move on to building a toolkit with a prompt behind a button and maybe get into prompt chaining and all this kind of stuff. And most of that is focused on tasks. And there's been a bit of this conversation about the difference between a task and a job, where a job is like a whole collection of different tasks in sometimes complex ways. And what an agent does is it's in this space between it's more than a task. It's a set of tasks towards a goal, but it maybe not quite yet at a full job, and it probably wouldn't make sense to completely replicate the jobs that we have. Just one last thing that the agents can do is they're not like software processes. Like you look at like the Better Collective example, and you could look at that architecture and think, well, it's just like a bunch of software that does this and does that and does the other. But the difference here is that with the reasoning from these models, they can handle all of these uncertainties and ambiguities and nuances just like a person. They're not brittle in the way that traditional software processes are. And so they can behave they can address unpredictability, they can recognize when guardrails are violated, they can do all these things that you can't ever hope to program into a software workflow.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. That helped some of us, I think. Okay. And Florent, based on your work at Hugging Face, how might AI agents actually support journalists? Now we heard some examples from before from the case, but day to day, how might AI agents support us in our work?
Well, most of the
my
mic is off.
We don't have any sound on Florent.
Is it on?
1 2 1 2. Or
I think it's on.
Yeah.
Can we have a hand mic?
1 2 1 2. Oh, okay.
Here we go.
So how AI agents can be useful for journalism? Well, I think lots of use cases we saw in the last few hours can be technically chained as an agent and perform tasks. So for example, for investigations and that kind of example, that could be very, very interesting. That said, I think AI agents are probably the next UI for AI, kind of. And we talked about the death of articles. I think AI agent is maybe the preliminary step of the death as the internet as we know it. It means that people will probably stop browsing the web. And it will have a huge effect on the ecosystem because agents will be able to browse the web for you faster, better, and without seeing the ads. So it means that AI agents can be the collapse of websites, similar to what we saw with the collapse of print. And I think this is fundamental to understand and engage with this technology because the ripple effects will be huge.
And for a journalist, going back to the newsroom, does that mean that the journalists will stop browsing the web as well? We will have a portfolio of agents doing all of this research for us, and we will kind of just manage them as a team?
That's a good question. Actually, we did some research with our ethicist at Hugging Face, and fully autonomous agents should not be deployed. I think we will still need to apply judgment. It's easier said than done because with AI agents, what you want basically is scaling the process. But how do you keep some spot checks? Because you can have really, really big scale. I mean, you can scroll the web on 24 hours and 24 hours and 7 days, but it's going to still be the real benefits of fully autonomous agents are not clear, but the harms are really, really clear. I mean, we could do some big mistakes, and so I think it needs to be deployed really carefully.
And we'll get back to that in a moment. But Irene, do you agree with Florent? Is this the end of browsing the internet? And what does this mean for newsroom? What is the strategic implications for news organizations?
I think that, again, this is one pathway where we really do see an extinction event for the way media is created and disseminated and distributed now. If this is the death of digital advertising, that not only harms the business model for every social media company and every search company, but also for newsrooms that rely on digital advertising for their own revenue models. I think that this triggers a different discussion about the role of the journalist and media as data collectors, as censors. Censors. I mean, because, yes, in flourishing democracies with great transparency and open data and things embedded in laws, you can have these kind of agents or others to automate tasks. But the first thing that anyone in power wants to do when they want to hide information is to create friction. So suddenly, we go back to the days where you have to go to some office and look at a printout and then take a picture yourself and then bring it home. In a market, and this is not, there are democracies that are destroying archives as we speak. In the markets that, a lot of them that I work in, that data is not online yet anyway. So, that role as kind of human sensors, data gatherers, is really important. If I were running a media company anywhere in the world, I would get into the business of being the masters of collecting data, structuring it, and having lots of conversations with the pro ratas as well as the AI developers of the world and the Hugging Faces to say, how do I make this data as useful as possible for those who want to use it? That is going to be the area of opportunity for media. And I think that we are, as journalists, because of our standards, because of our processes, because of the resilience that we have in digging when powers want to obfuscate, that's going to be the value add in the chain.
And I think it will raises a fundamental question about the value of the act of writing. Actually, in the tech industry, we have a soul-searching discussion about how do we write documentation for coding. Because actually, if you take a look at Google, for example, 80% of the code is actually written by a machine, but we still write documentation for humans. if you think about journalism, the act of writing could be radically different. If you write for an agent, and let's say each of us have an agent, our devices will evolve, we have powerful agents on our devices, so we will be able to let our agents loose in the wild. And so as a news organization, you could have your agent talking to my agent and be like, okay, here's what I have as information snippets. You don't write a full-fledged article. Again, you write some information structured as a readable machine format. So it's going to be impactful in terms of change management in the newsroom, because I think many of us went into journalism because we love words, but that might change.
So basically, media and publishers will be writing or creating news for agents, for everyone's agents in the future, is what you're saying?
I don't have a crystal ball, but to a large extent, probably yes. That said, it will also probably raise the value of craftsmanship in a sense, because when you have a product at scale, you also want some jewelry and read long-form articles and so on. And also, maybe it's something we'll talk about in the liquid content panel, but I think if you project yourself in a few months or a few years, if AI has intermediated everything, what's left? I think, and I really, really enjoyed the presentation of Naja this morning, what's left is a human connection. And I think the value of connecting with people, with journalists, is going to be more and more important, which is counterintuitive because we tend to, as journalists, be like, oh, we are behind the scene, or we don't project ourselves as the front scene, but maybe it's going to be more and more important.
All right, let's talk a little bit about oversight, the very famous human in the loop, which has been challenged a few times on this conference already. We talked a lot about it a few years ago, I think. It was always human in the loop, we need the human in the loop, and now it's like, human in the loop, so annoying. We don't need those, it's not efficient. But David, you've warned the agents, they almost work. But they can still hallucinate, they can still go off track like LLMs can. What kind of risk do you see in moving too fast with this?
So agents, we saw the Better Collective example, but agents are being used in production in newsrooms right now. So one interesting event recently, just a couple of weeks ago, is that NewsQuest in the UK hired their first AI agent orchestrator. That was the job title. And so that job is essentially to manage a team, except it's not a team of people, it's a team of agents, right? And I don't know the details of what those agents are and what they're doing and all the rest of it, but this is going to affect us in the news industry on the production side much, much sooner than some sort of yet to be determined kind of ecology of agents as assistants to consumers. We might never get to the point where we have personal agents. It might turn out differently, we don't really know. But the ability to use agents in production is here now. So I think the risks are, they're kind of amplified from this kind of first year or two of work with LLMs, because you're essentially, by passing over control to that kind of reasoning part of these agents, that's an exchange of power, and the whole point of an agent is that it makes decisions, and sometimes quite micro decisions. So you have to trust it at some level, and you have to evaluate it. You have to have some kind of a way to assess. I mean, when you manage a team of employees, you have a way to assess, how they're doing. What is that with agents? I think we're still just at the very early days. So I think there's a risk that the opportunities in production are quite attractive, but there's a real risk that we might get ahead of the evaluation and the sort of the accurate decision making about how much we can trust them and for what.
Yeah, because humans are slow, right? So AI is very, very fast. Humans are very slow compared to that. So it may be AI fast, and then comes the human, which is slow and has to ingest all this information and find out if it's correct or written in. What do we do about that? Do we have the patience for that?
So that's both. That's difficult, but it's also the opportunity, because human in the loop is a friction point in this kind of idealistic future of kind of AI news gathering at scale, AI experience production at scale. and then this human in the loop in the middle kind of slows it all down. So there is a potential here, and there's a lot to figure out, that journalists become more like managers. They become, everybody becomes like an editor-in-chief of a little newsroom of agents, and that editorial judgment is still applied. It's applied in the prompts, it's applied in the evaluation, it's applied in the sort of the standards, in the values that are in those prompts, all of these things. But it's done at this level of abstraction that's above the individual journalist doing journalism. It's more at the EIC kind of level where they're making policy decisions and dealing with special cases and all this kind of stuff.
Is that how you see oversight working for humans being working together with agents? How do you see it, Irene?
I think for certain types of journalism, sports is a great example, financial reporting. I mean, we've already seen this automation in a lot of ways for, the first alert, the first write for a company earnings report, right? Because it's structured data, you can give the first thing. And actually, algorithms are trading off of that report, and it's a matter of milliseconds, right? Who wins, Bloomberg or Reuters for any particular thing. I think that this is going to be very, very, very hard to outsource to an agent when you're thinking about things like, is this person lying to me in this interview? In countries where, or political reporting, where half the time you're trying to understand what the meaning is behind what they didn't say, right? Tea leaf reading. I know that, Dave, we spoke about this, that there have been efforts to try to build tech around that sort of political intelligence through data sets. But it doesn't change the fact that people change all the time.
But on that, I think the distinction between structured data and unstructured data, that distinction is kind of going away in the face of the capabilities of LLMs. And I'll give you an example from, this was a project I did, just a personal project in 2023, where I tried to replicate, this was using some really primitive agent functionality in a software framework called LangChain. And so I tried to replicate this famous investigative story that The Guardian did, and I think it was 2011, around MPs' expenses. And that was kind of famous because they used a kind of crowdsourced review of all of these documents. And part of that was things like composing emails that I would send to the offices of MPs asking questions, and then I would have the LLM create the email, and then I would send it from my email account, and then I would get the response, and then I put it into the LLM to see if I could have that interaction. And honestly, I think that these models, if they're prompted correctly and managed right, they can detect whether something is fishy or not, or whether something sounds suspicious, or somebody seems contradictory, or the tone is off. I think, it's not a simple thing, but I don't think that's necessarily out of reach of these machines. They have a capacity with emotion, with nuance, with subtlety. You got to bring it out in the prompting and maybe some fine-tuning, but I think it's quite within reach.
But with that specific example, part of that Guardian investigation, if we're talking about the same one, was the crowdsource, meaning, hey, I go to that pub, I looked at these expenses, and I go to that pub every week, and I haven't seen him there. Yep. So what is that bill? Again, the role of the human sensor, right? And so I absolutely, at scale, I think that you could start doing these sorts of things, but you could imagine that there's a time when suddenly there's a tool that automates that kind of letter collection, and offices are inundated, and so they say, you know what? Now we're not obligated to answer.
Yeah. Or they have their own agent that responds, and you've got some kind of communication thing going on between agents that people are less relevant to.
That reminds me, sorry, there was a skit that I heard one time where two people had, this is back in the days of this start of outsourcing, where these two friends, one of them got tired of hearing the other person's problems, so they hired someone to be there to outsource the friendship, and then the other person got really mad and then hired someone to outsource the friendship, and so you had two people who were not these two people who were having conversation. I mean, that's where that's where weid get to.
That is a real.
And me, as a human sensor, can sense that Florent wants to say something in the conversations.
Yeah, but I think the more autonomy you give to an agent, the more human oversight you give up. which is fundamental as a framework. And I mean, you can have a value assessment each time you deploy an agent. Like, is it accurate? Is it like in terms of truthfulness, of helpfulness, etc. But I mean, the two core capacities or skills of a journalist is, I think, curiosity and editorial judgment. And that cannot be replicated by an agent, because an agent will not autonomously starting to ask itself a question. You have to ask a question to an agent, which is half of the work we do as journalists. We ask ourselves questions about things in society. And the second one is, and it's tricky because, yeah, it can have some nuance. It can understand like a slight shift in a pattern or something like that, but to apply editorial judgment is more complex. So again, how do you keep these two core values in your deployment of agent is crucial.
Mm-hmm. And we're already running a little bit over time, but I promised to see if you had any burning questions in the audience, because we have a lot to talk about here, definitely. But anyone in the audience who wants to ask a question about agents, now is your chance. We have one here.
This is a very easy question. So, what is the world that we would like to live in and with?
Wow, that's easy. What is the world that we would like to live in?
Yeah.
And will.
Yeah. The will is a harder part, but you know, I think the world that we would like to live in. The way I like to think of this is compare a citizen in 1425 or 1625 or 1825 and what they knew about their world, you know, and compare that with what we know about our world now that we've got, you know, journalism as a profession and the printing press and then radio and television and the internet and all the rest of it. We know vastly more about our world. We can hold our politicians and the people in power to account at vastly greater degrees than people could in the past because of that information. There's no reason to think that has stopped just at the moment we happen to be here right now. You know, so what I like to think about is, well, what might we be able to do, you know, with the current AI tools to make us far more aware of what our world, what's happening in our world, what our politicians are doing, you know, what the things that affect us, all of that kind of field of information around us. What might we do 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years down the road with, you know, AGI, you know, or even further with some kind of superintelligence? What might that let us know about our world, and might it be as far from where we are now as we are from like a person in a small town in 1425, you know? And so I think there is a very real kind of ideal that we can aim towards. Now whether we head in that direction or whether it just, you know, heads in a much worse direction, you know, that's the big question, and I think it's up to all of us at some level, you know, the little bit of agency that we have. But I think there's a very clear ideal for, if it all works out well, you know, we could just know vastly more than we can even imagine what we can know right now.
I think that's a great question to end with. Florent, do you want to comment here as well?
Well, in a nutshell, I think the world I would like to live in with AI agents is a world where I spend less time on my screen, which could be cool, and with an intelligence multiplier, which is what AI agent could be, if we release them in a clever manner, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And Irene?
I think fully agree, and I would say that I think what we view as the real world is going to be much more inclusive of these virtual places that we operate. And the distinction that we see is not going to be the distinction that my kids see.
But you talked about friction. Sorry to get back to that, because when I think about AI agents, I think about kind of, then we minimize friction again. So what will happen? Do we need that kind of friction to be happy people, to live in a world that we want to live in, or do you see that as a problem of friction removal here?
I just moved from Singapore to London, so I have personally experienced the difference from living in a frictionless place to a place with more friction. I think that the real world will hopefully still offer enough friction.
Okay,
to build.
we have that. All right. Thank you, the three of you, for an interesting conversation that could have been half an hour longer, but we'll end it here. Thank you so much. All right. It's time for a break before we head to the last part of block 3 about liquid content and hyper-personalization. We will be back here at 3 o'clock on the dot, I hope.